Scotland, December 1900. The sea was a black, restless beast that winter. Waves broke like thunder against the jagged cliffs of the Outer Hebrides, and the wind sang with a voice that seemed older than time itself. In the middle of this fury, perched upon a barren rock some 20 miles off the coast of Scotland, stood the Lighthouse of Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles. It was a lonely outpost, a prison of duty and stone. For months at a time, men lived there, tending the light that guided ships through the treacherous waters. It was a post of vigilance, of isolation, of silence. Yet what occurred in December of 1900 would turn this ordinary lighthouse into one of the most enduring mysteries of the sea. The ship that saw nothing. On December 15th, the steamer Archdor passed through those waters, battling a storm as it sailed from Philadelphia to Leith. Its captain noted with unease that the great light of Flannan did not shine. Normally, its steady beam could be seen cutting through the night sky, a beacon for sailors in peril. But on that night, only darkness waited where the light should have been. The captain sent a message upon docking in Leith, reporting the extinguished beacon. Yet due to storms and delays, no immediate action was taken. It was only days later, on December 26th, that the relief vessel Hesperus was dispatched, carrying supplies and the replacement keeper Joseph Moore. What awaited them upon arrival was not neglect or dereliction. It was a scene of stillness so strange, it has echoed across history. The arrival. When the Hesperus reached the island, its crew expected to see the keepers waiting at the landing dock, waving as was custom. But no one appeared. The island was silent, save for the roar of the wind and the screech of seabirds. Joseph Moore, uneasy, was the first to step ashore. He climbed the steep, wet path to the lighthouse, his boots slipping on slick stone. When he reached the door, he found it locked. With trembling hands, he turned the key and entered. Inside, the lighthouse was immaculate. The beds were made. The clock on the wall had stopped. The lamps were cleaned and filled, ready for use. In the kitchen, a meal had been laid out, bread, cold meat, and pickles, untouched, as though the men had left in the middle of eating. One chair was overturned, lying on the floor. But there was no sign of the keepers. Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur, and James Duckett, the 3 men assigned to tend the light, had vanished. The search. Moore called for the others from the Hesperus. Together, they searched the island. They found no footprints, no bodies, no signs of violence. Only the western landing showed disturbance. Ropes had been torn from their fastenings, and the iron railings were twisted as if by great force. Captain Harvey of the Hesperus wrote in his log, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers have disappeared from the island." The clock stopped, and other signs indicate that the light had been unattended for a week or more. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. It was the simplest explanation. The men had been caught in a storm, swept away by the furious sea. Yet something in the scene resisted such easy closure. The half-eaten meal, the overturned chair, the locked door, the eerie stillness of a place abandoned too quickly. The men who vanished. The 3 keepers were no novices. James Duckett was the principal keeper, a man of long experience, calm and respected. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, was younger but disciplined, though his log entries weeks earlier recorded severe storms that had shaken the island. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, filling in for another man on leave. Known as a brawler and quick to anger, he was the only one of the 3 with a reputation for impulsiveness. And yet, together, they had worked the light as generations of keepers had done before them. Alone, perhaps prone to fear, but not incompetent. Not careless. Not men to simply walk into the jaws of the sea without reason. The theories begin. Word spread quickly across Scotland. Newspapers seized on the disappearance, and speculation blossomed. Some claimed the men had been swept away by an enormous wave, what would later be called a rogue wave. Others suggested one man had gone mad, murdered his companions, and cast himself into the sea. There were whispers, too, of something older, darker, the wrath of the sea spirits, or the curse of St. Flannan himself, for whom the islands were named. But most chilling were the theories that spoke not of accident, nor of madness, but of intrusion. That something had come to the island, something not human, and taken the keepers away. An island of omens, for the Flannan Isles had long carried a reputation of strangeness. Sailors spoke of lights on the cliffs, of voices heard in the wind. The isles were uninhabited, save for the lighthouse, because the land was considered cursed, unfit for settlement. Sheep left there for grazing were rounded up quickly, as no shepherd would spend the night. Local folklore claimed the islands were haunted by spirits, by phantom monks who had once built a chapel on Eilean Moor. Strange shadows were said to walk among the ruins, and seabirds circled the island in patterns that made fishermen mutter prayers. So when the three keepers disappeared, it was not merely an isolated tragedy. It was the fulfillment of whispered fears, a story that seemed to confirm the islands were never meant to be tamed by man. The vanishing point. In the weeks that followed, investigations were carried out. Reports were filed. The Board of Trade concluded the men had been swept to their deaths by a storm. It was neat, convenient, and unsatisfying, because three men, each trained to survive the fury of the Atlantic, each bound by the strict routines of lighthouse duty, had vanished without a single witness, without a single body, without a single scream carried on the wind. And the lighthouse, immaculate and waiting, stood silent, its light extinguished, as though mocking the idea that order or reason had ever ruled there. The island kept its secret, and so began one of the most enduring mysteries of the sea, the disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers. The shadow of December. December in the Hebrides is not for the faint of heart. It is a month of endless storms, of nights longer than the imagination dares to grasp, of a sea that seems less an expanse of water than a realm of chaos. For the keepers of the Flannan Isles lighthouse, December 1900 was meant to be another test of endurance. Yet it became a descent into silence. The logs recovered from the lighthouse offered only fragments, whispers written in trembling ink. On December 12th, Second Assistant Thomas Marshall noted severe winds, the worst I have ever seen in 20 years. He wrote that the seas were so violent they lashed at the tower itself, threatening to shatter the glass. His words were uncharacteristic, almost fevered. It was as though he had felt something in the storm that unsettled him to his core. The next entry recorded that James Duckett, the principal keeper, was unusually quiet and that Donald MacArthur, tough, stubborn MacArthur, had broken into tears. Prayed together, the entry noted. All afraid. The last entry, dated December 15th, was even stranger. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. After that, the pages fell silent. The silence of the tower. For Joseph Moore, who read those entries after stepping into the abandoned lighthouse, the words were a wound. He had known keepers all his life, men who prided themselves on strength and composure. To see a log filled with fear, prayers, and tears was to glimpse something unnatural pressing upon them. But the strangest detail was this. No storms had been reported in the region on the days those entries described. Ships sailing nearby, towns on the mainland, all recorded only mild weather. The gales and monstrous waves that Marshall described seemed to exist only on that lonely rock, as if the island itself were experiencing a storm unseen by the rest of the world. Theories of the sea. When news spread, the rational explanations came quickly. The sea is treacherous, unpredictable. Perhaps a sudden squall had struck. Perhaps a freak wave had risen from the deep. The west landing showed damage. Twisted railings, ropes torn from their fixings. It was easy to imagine the men working there, securing equipment against the storm, only to be snatched away by the Atlantic. But there were questions. Why would all three men leave the tower at once, abandoning their posts, their duties, their meal? Protocol required one man to remain inside at all times. Even in crisis, the rule was never broken. Yet the lighthouse was empty, and the door locked behind them, as though someone had deliberately sealed the silence. And what of the log entries, with their storms no one else had seen, with their sudden collapse into prayer and fear? Something gnawed at the story, something that made it less tragedy and more enigma. Whispers on the mainland. On the mainland, in fishing villages along the coast, the disappearance became legend almost overnight. Women crossed themselves when the subject arose. Sailors spat over their shoulders. The Flannan Isles were already considered unlucky ground, haunted by the ghost of Saint Flannan himself, whose chapel ruins still stood on Eilean Moor. They said the monks of centuries past had seen strange lights dancing upon the cliffs, heard voices chanting in languages not of men. They abandoned the islands, leaving only prayers scratched into stone. Some believed the sea gods had claimed the land, and that the lighthouse, an intrusion of human hands, was a provocation. Now, with three men gone, those stories resurfaced. The storm that only they had seen. The final words in the log. God is over all. Some whispered that the men had not been swept away but taken, claimed by the sea or by something within it. The keeper's descent. Of the three, Donald MacArthur became the focus of many tales. Known for his temper, he was said to be volatile, quick to fight. Some imagined that isolation had driven him to madness, that in the claustrophobic confines of the tower, surrounded by howling winds, he had lashed out at the others. Perhaps there had been a quarrel, a murder, a moment of bloodshed. But there were no stains, no signs of struggle. The house was immaculate, as though the men had risen calmly from their meal, left their chairs, and walked into oblivion. And then there was the overturned chair. A single piece of evidence, small and ominous. It suggested suddenness, interruption. That one man had stood, or been forced to stand, so violently the chair toppled. After that, only absence. A door closed. What unsettled investigators most was the locked door. When Moore arrived, he had to unlock it himself. If the men had left in panic, why would they secure the tower behind them? Was it instinct? Or was it something else, something they were trying to keep out? Theories multiplied. Some said they had seen something in the sea, a shape, a light, an apparition, and gone to investigate. Others claimed they had heard a sound, a voice carried on the wind, calling them down to the rocks. For if the logs were to be believed, fear had already taken root in their hearts days before. Fear that drove them to pray together, to cry, to write words of desperation in a book meant only for duty. The island itself. Eilean Moor was a place of strangeness long before the lighthouse was built. Fishermen refused to land there except in clear daylight. They spoke of shadows that moved among the ruins of the chapel. They claimed that seabirds wheeled above the island in formations too precise, too unnatural, as if guided by unseen hands. Some even said the island sang, that on certain nights, when the wind cut just right, a low hum could be heard from the cliffs, a vibration that set the teeth on edge. Scientists would call it Aeolian tones, the wind carving its music from the rocks. But the islanders called it a warning. To them, the disappearance of the three keepers was not a mystery at all. It was inevitability. The island had claimed them, as it would claim any who stayed too long. A darkness that lingers. After the Board of Trade filed its report, men lost by accident, swept away while securing equipment, the world tried to move on. But the story refused to die. Sailors refused to trust the light. Relief keepers spoke of unease, of strange dreams, of whispers in the night. One wrote years later, "There are times when I feel there are more than three of us here. When I ascend the tower at night, I sense someone just behind me, though when I turn, no one is there." Another claimed he heard voices outside during a storm, shouting his name, though the island was deserted. The mystery of the Flannan Isles was not contained to 1900. It spread forward, its shadow touching every man who ever lived in that lonely tower, as though the disappearance was not an ending but a beginning. And in the small villages of Scotland, where old stories are told by firelight, people still whisper that the three keepers never left the island at all. Not truly. That on stormy nights, when the wind howls across the sea, their figures can be seen walking the cliffs, lanterns in hand, forever tending a light that no longer burns. The inquiry begins. When the news of the vanished keepers reached the Scottish mainland, shock turned quickly into duty. The Northern Lighthouse Board, guardians of every beacon along the storm-battered coast, convened an inquiry. A tragedy had occurred, yes, but it was also an embarrassment, a blot on their reputation for safety and vigilance. They dispatched Superintendent Robert Muirhead, a man of rigid posture and unswerving loyalty to the board. He had known the missing keepers personally. He had appointed them himself. As he set sail for the Flannans, he carried both professional resolve and private grief. Upon arrival, Muirhead inspected the west landing. He noted ropes torn from their moorings, evidence of recent damage, a box secured 30 feet above the waves smashed and emptied. He concluded that the men had gone down to secure the landing in the midst of a storm. A wave must have come, colossal and sudden, sweeping them away. It was a plausible explanation. Too plausible. The public wanted closure. Muirhead delivered it. The men, acting in the line of duty, were overwhelmed by the sea. No further blame is attached. The file was closed. The lighthouse was manned once more. But no one believed it. The doubts of sailors. Among sailors, the verdict was treated with contempt. They knew the sea better than any superintendent. Yes, waves were dangerous, but keepers were trained, disciplined. Never would all three abandon the tower at once. Never would they risk their lives so foolishly. And besides, the logbooks told another story. The men were terrified days before. They spoke of storms no one else saw, of prayers and tears, of something unseen pressing against their sanity. Muirhead ignored the log's emotional weight. To him, it was the rantings of men under strain. To the sailors, it was a warning written in ink and desperation. The sea might take lives, but it did not bend reality, did not conjure storms that left no trace, did not inspire men of iron discipline to break every rule they lived by. Something else had happened. Theories of madness. In the months that followed, newspapers seized upon the story. The public was hungry for detail, for mystery. Some papers suggested madness. Isolation, after all, is poison to the mind. Perhaps MacArthur, hot-tempered and volatile, had suffered a breakdown. In a fit of rage or delirium, he attacked the others. The confrontation spilled outside, where a wave finished the job. But this theory faltered under scrutiny. There was no blood, no sign of violence, no shattered furniture. The lighthouse was too orderly, too calm, for a scene of conflict. And then there was the locked door. Why would a murderer take the time to seal the tower before vanishing? Madness might explain one man. It did not explain three. The lights in the sky. Other reports filtered in, stranger still. Fishermen spoke of unusual lights in the sky above the Flannans during December, gleaming orbs, shifting colors, hovering where no star should be. One account, published years later, claimed that a ship passing near the islands on the night of the disappearance saw a beam of green light shoot upward from the cliffs. It was dismissed as rumor, but it clung stubbornly to the tale, a thread woven into the growing tapestry of legend. If true, it suggested something not of sea or storm, but of another order entirely. The idea that the keepers were not drowned but taken from above. A land of old superstitions. In the Hebrides, stories grow like heather, rooted in old soil. Long before the lighthouse, shepherds avoided the Flannan Isles. They spoke of spirits dwelling among the rocks, of fairies that lured men to their deaths. The ruined chapel of St. Flannan was said to be haunted by the monks who once prayed there, their chants carried on the wind even centuries later. To islanders, the disappearance was no mystery. It was fulfillment. The sea and the spirits had reclaimed what was theirs. The lighthouse was an intrusion, and the men who tended it were trespassers. One tale spread, that a giant sea-bird had carried them away, a creature older than memory, summoned by their presence. Another claimed the men had been called into the sea by selkies, shapeshifters who wore the skins of seals and sang irresistible songs. Fantastic, yes, but in the villages where the story was retold by firelight, it felt less like invention and more like inevitability. The weight of the logbook. And still the logbook. December 12th. Severe winds, worst in 20 years. December 13th. Prayed together. MacArthur crying. December 15th. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. The log did not read like duty. It read like testimony, a record of men besieged not by weather, but by fear. Some historians later argued the entries were forged, inserted to heighten the mystery. Yet no one could prove it. If real, they suggested that the men experienced something no chart, no report could capture. A reality bent out of shape on that remote isle. The Watcher's dream. Years later, one relief keeper, sent to man the Flannan Tower, wrote of a dream he had while there. In it, he saw 3 men standing on the west landing, looking out to sea. They were not struggling, not afraid. They simply stared as though waiting. When he woke, the wind outside screamed with such force that he believed the men were still out there, gazing into a horizon only they could see. The dream unnerved him so deeply that he begged for reassignment. He never set foot on the Flannans again. The persistence of mystery. As the years passed, the Flannan Isles' disappearance became one of the most retold maritime mysteries in the world. Unlike the tales of shipwrecks or storms, it had no body, no wreckage, no closure. 3 men had simply vanished, leaving behind warm meals, half-finished chores, and silence. The explanations, waves, madness, abduction, spirits, were fragments that never fit the whole. What endured was not fact but feeling. A sense that on those islands, reality is thinner, more fragile, and that sometimes it tears, swallowing men whole. The end of answers. Officially, the file remains closed. The lighthouse still stands, automated now, its beams sweeping the sea without need of keepers. No one lives there anymore. No one prays or writes in logs or sets tables for meals never eaten. But still, on certain nights, sailors say they see figures pacing the lantern room. 3 shadows moving against the glass, tending a light that needs no tending. And in the villages, the story is told again. The storm no one else saw, the prayers of strong men, the calm sea, the locked door. A story with no ending, except the one whispered on the wind, carried out across the Atlantic. God is over all. A puzzle too neat. The inquiry had been wrapped neatly, like a package tied with string. 3 men, lost to the sea. A tragedy, but nothing more. Yet for those who lingered on the details, the neatness was precisely the problem. Real tragedies are messy, uncertain, scattered with debris and witness accounts. This one was not. It had the silence of something hidden, or something greater than paperwork could capture. The more people stared at the facts, the less they resembled facts at all. Government shadows. In the years after the disappearance, whispers spread of a cover-up. Britain, after all, was no stranger to secrecy. The turn of the 20th century was an age of espionage and empire, when experiments were conducted in silence, and inconvenient events were buried beneath official statements. Some suggested that the keepers had witnessed something they should not have. A naval exercise, perhaps, involving new weaponry tested against the cliffs. Others claimed that the government was experimenting with sound or light technologies on the remote islands. If so, the keepers might have been silenced, not by waves but by deliberate hands. The absence of bodies fit too easily into this theory. A storm scatters remains, but deliberate removal ensures none are ever found. Of course, evidence was absent, but absence itself became fuel. If the state wished to erase 3 men, would it not erase the evidence too? The isolation effect. Psychologists, decades later, saw in the Flannan case a darker truth about the human mind. Lighthouse duty was unlike any other work. Long stretches of silence, storms raging without pause, the horizon unchanging. Days blurred, nights stretched, and companionship became both a lifeline and a cage. The men were chosen for their steadiness, their reliability. But no mind is immune to the erosion of solitude. Imagine the sounds, the endless crash of waves, the drone of wind through cracks, the moan of iron chains in the storm. Imagine the monotony, the same faces, the same duties, the same walls. Over weeks, reality itself could seem uncertain. Perhaps what the men wrote in the logbook, prayers, tears, dread, were not responses to storms or omens, but to their own unraveling minds. This did not explain their disappearance, but it explained why they might abandon reason, step outside in defiance of rules, and vanish into the storm. Yet even this explanation falters on the locked door, on the meals laid neatly, on the precision of absence. Madness rarely leaves such tidy silence. The thin places. In Celtic folklore, there are places where the barrier between worlds is thinner, like worn fabric. The Hebrides are full of them. Ancient standing stones, caves that breathe with the tide, chapels built where druids once held rituals. The Flannan Isles were one such place. Shepherds, centuries earlier, left them untouched except to graze sheep briefly. They believed the isles were touched by otherworldly powers. The ruined chapel of St. Flannan was itself built upon older ground, where offerings to unseen beings were whispered into the wind. A thin place is not haunted, it is permeable. It allows passage, not only for spirits to cross into our world, but for humans to be drawn into theirs. If 3 men disappeared on such a place, islanders said, it was not by storm or wave but by crossing. The sea did not take them, the isle itself did. Strange precedents. The Flannan case was not alone. In 1849, a keeper stationed at another Hebridean lighthouse was found wandering the cliffs, dazed, unable to explain where his partner had gone. The man eventually returned to work, but he spoke in half-sentences, as though words could not form around what he had seen. In 1865, a fisherman claimed to see 2 men waving frantically from the Flannan cliffs. He attempted to sail closer, but as mist rolled in, they vanished. The lighthouse had not yet been built. Later still, in 1953, an automated weather station on one of the smaller islands reported sudden instrument failure for 6 hours. When the team returned to investigate, they found nothing wrong with the machinery. The station worked perfectly afterward. The event was never explained. Each of these stories, minor in themselves, were woven into the larger tapestry. Together, they painted the Flannans not as an isolated incident, but as a recurring wound in reality. The pull of the sea. Some theories leaned on the sea's own magnetism. Certain parts of the ocean, sailors swore, carried strange currents, not just of water but of energy. Compasses spun wildly, lights bent oddly, sounds echoed with unnatural clarity. The waters around the Flannans, deep and violent, might hold such anomalies. Perhaps the men were drawn, not physically but irresistibly, into the waves, compelled by forces they could neither see nor resist. It echoed older myths, mermaids calling sailors, selkies beckoning from the rocks, spirits luring men to their deaths. Only now, in the modern tongue, it was called magnetism, psychology, or energy. But to the villagers, the difference was meaningless. A mystery by any name is still a mystery. Silence in stone. To visit the lighthouse today, automated and empty, is to confront this silence. The rooms are bare, the machinery humming faintly. No laughter, no prayers, no boots against the iron stair. Only stone, sea, and sky. And yet, Some visitors report unease, a feeling of being watched, the sense that someone has just left the room, though no one lives there anymore. On windless days, the gulls circle without sound, as if muted. On stormy nights, locals say, a light appears not from the lantern but from the cliffs below, brief, strange, pulsing, as though the men are still there, in some form, sending signals across a gulf we cannot measure. A mystery without gravity. Every theory, wave, madness, government, spirits, floats without weight. Each answers part of the riddle, but never the whole. And so the Flannan Isles remain unsolved. Not because answers are lacking, but because too many answers exist. In that abundance, the truth slips away. The keepers become symbols of the sea's cruelty, of the mind's fragility, of the state's secrecy, of the other world's pull. Each generation shapes them anew, telling the story again with different emphasis. But always the same image endures, 3 men gone. From fact to fable, the human mind cannot resist a mystery. The moment the 3 keepers vanished, the story ceased being a tragedy of lost men and became something larger. It was retold in pubs, written in newspapers, whispered along the coast. Each telling reshaped the details, sometimes a storm, sometimes a shadow, sometimes voices in the wind. And in the retelling, the Flannan Isles ceased to be just rock and stone. They became a stage, and the keepers became actors in a play whose script was rewritten endlessly. The lighthouse stood silent, but the world around it buzzed with stories. The Ballad of the Keepers. The most famous of these stories was a ballad written in 1912 by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, a poet who never set foot on the Isles, but captured the imagination of thousands with his verses. His ballad begins with relief crews arriving, the silence of the tower pressing against them, the half-eaten meals still on the table, the missing men nowhere to be found. The poem ends not with answers but with awe, 3 men caught up into the mystery of the sea. For readers across Britain, the ballad was more real than the official reports. It painted images they could see, lamps burning, chairs overturned, beds unmade. Gibson's words became the truth in a way the dry inquiry never could. School children memorized lines, sailors carried the verses in their pockets, and soon the keepers were not simply missing, they were legends. Songs on the wind. Sailors adapted the story into songs. Verses were sung in taverns of Stornoway and Inverness, their melodies carried by drunk voices and cracked fiddles. In these songs, the keepers' fates shifted with each chorus, sometimes stolen by sea spirits, sometimes taken by God, sometimes punished for unknown sins. These songs transformed the Flannan Isles into a kind of modern ghost ship. Just as the Flying Dutchman wandered the oceans, so too did the ghost lighthouse watch over the Hebrides. Locals, uneasy with this transformation, accepted it nonetheless. Mystery feeds economies of story, and the Isles became richer in myth than they ever had been in sheep or stone. Stories in the papers. The press, eager for readership, exaggerated details shamelessly. Headlines spoke of the phantom lighthouse, men vanished into air, and Scotland's Bermuda Triangle. One report claimed that the relief ship had seen strange lights in the sky before arriving at the Isles. Another swore that the last logbook entries described a great bird at the window, blacker than night. Neither detail existed in reality, but they lived in print, and once in print they were believed. Newspapers are ephemeral, but their stories linger in memory, shaping the tale in ways official documents could not undo. The novels of the sea. As the decades passed, novelists seized the Flannan mystery. In the 1920s and 30s, pulp writers folded it into tales of cursed islands and haunted seas. One book claimed the keepers were victims of Atlantean experiments. Another argued they had been abducted by a passing vessel engaged in smuggling. By the 1960s, science fiction authors had embraced the story. The keepers were recast as the first victims of alien abduction, plucked from their lonely station and carried into the sky. The image of the lighthouse, its beams sweeping, its tower solitary, fit neatly into the language of UFOs. The Flannan Isles, once obscure, had been fully absorbed into the literature of the strange. Folklore reshaped. In the Hebrides, the story bent to older traditions. Islanders already believed in Gruagach, household spirits that could bless or curse, in Selkies, sealfolk who lured men into the sea, and in the Kaliak, a hag who stirred storms with her staff. The disappearance was explained through these figures. One tale insisted the men had angered the sea hag by mocking her in prayer. Another told of Selkies, jealous of the keepers' wives, who dragged them beneath the waves. These explanations did not compete with modern theories, they coexisted. For villagers, the story was not about fact but about meaning. The men were taken because the Isles demanded sacrifice, because the sea is jealous, because no one can live so close to the edge of the world without paying a price. The tourist pilgrimage. As aviation expanded in the mid-20th century, the Flannan Isles became accessible to tourists. Boats ferried visitors to the cliffs, where guides recited the story. Some guides leaned into folklore, others into conspiracy, but all knew the visitors wanted chills. Tourists left with photographs of the lonely lighthouse, the broken chapel of St. Flannan, and the wild seabirds wheeling overhead. But what they carried most was the story. And so the Flannan Isles economy shifted again, from sheep to silence to story. Modern media. The 21st century only magnified the myth. Documentaries framed the case with ominous music, cutting between storm footage and interviews with historians. Podcasts dissected the logbook entries, blending history with speculation. Online forums debated endlessly. Was it a wave, madness, or something unearthly? In 2019, a feature film titled The Vanishing dramatized the event, choosing betrayal and greed as the cause. The reviews were mixed, but the fact that the story could still command cinema budgets more than a century later proved its staying power. Social media, too, gave it new life. Short videos told the story in minutes, watched by millions across the globe. For many, the Flannan Isles mystery was not an old tale but a fresh discovery. Why the myth persists. Why does the disappearance cling so tightly to imagination? Perhaps because it resists closure. A shipwreck leaves debris. A murder leaves blood. Even unsolved crimes leave bodies. But here there is nothing, only absence. Absence is fertile soil for stories. It invites the listener to fill the void with their own fears, beliefs, and hopes. In the end, the Flannan Isles are not just a mystery. They are a mirror. Each age sees what it wishes. Divine punishment, alien abduction, government conspiracy, psychological collapse. The story bends, never breaks, and always remains. The ghost in the lighthouse. The myth-making has a side effect. For many, the Flannan keepers are not gone. They exist, in the collective imagination, as restless presences. Visitors claim to hear voices in the stairwell, boots on the iron steps, whispers carried by the wind. Some say that on winter nights, 3 shadowy figures can be seen against the lantern glass, as though still tending the light. Whether one believes or not, the persistence of the tale makes the keepers eternal. Not as men who died, but as figures who slipped sideways, into song, into legend, into the mist that wraps the Hebrides. The lighthouse as a tomb. By the time the 20th century faded into the 21st, the lighthouse of the Flannan Isles had already taken on the weight of a tomb. No bodies had ever been found, no coffins ever lowered into the soil of Eilean Moor, yet the very stones seemed to grieve. Winds moaned through the iron railings. Rust streaked down the lantern room's windows like dried tears. Visitors, rare and few, spoke of the air as thick, heavy, like the hush before a funeral. But unlike a funeral, there had been no closure, no farewell, no names carved into headstones. Instead, there was only the ache of absence stretched across generations. The lighthouse remained lit, then automated, then left in silence once more. Yet its beam, real or remembered, was always searching, not for ships, but for its keepers. Theories as phantoms. Theories swirled like mist, each one a phantom story inhabiting the tower. The wave, a colossal surge, born from an Atlantic storm, sweeping 3 men into the sea with merciless indifference. The fight, tempers frayed, madness born of isolation, steel against flesh, and a murderer who returned to the waves rather than face his deed. The abduction, strange lights in the sky, a whisper of engines not of this earth, 3 keepers plucked like figures from a board game. The curse, the wrath of St. Flannan, punishing men for mocking his hermitage, or the hag of the sea demanding her tribute. Each theory had its believers, its champions, its disciples. Each left unanswered questions. Each could be true. And so the mystery endured, less as history and more as haunting. Echoes in the wind. Travelers to Eilean Moor report sensations that defy logic. One woman, a photographer, described hearing men's laughter echoing through the stairwell, though she was alone. Another, a historian, felt a hand brush his shoulder while standing by the keeper's quarters. No one was there. Sailors, rounding the aisle, whisper of lights flickering in the lantern even though the lamp has long been extinguished. Fishermen claim they see 3 silhouettes on the balcony, looking out across the endless sea. Perhaps imagination plays tricks. Perhaps the human heart cannot accept a story unfinished, and so it paints its own ending. Or perhaps absence does not mean departure. The sea keeps its secrets. The Atlantic is older than memory, older than history, older than the stones of the Flannan Isles. It has swallowed entire civilizations without leaving evidence. Why should 3 men be any different? The sea is not cruel, nor kind. It is simply vast. Its silence is not emptiness, but fullness, full of secrets too deep for us to touch. The keepers may lie there still, their bones scattered among rocks and sand, or they may not. What matters is that the sea has claimed them, not just their bodies, but their story. And the sea does not return what it claims, a story that refuses to end. Most mysteries fade. Time erodes them. Witnesses die, evidence decays, interest wanes. But the Flannan Isles resist. Over a century later, the disappearance is told as though it happened yesterday. Each retelling reshapes it, like waves reshaping the shore. The mystery is immortal because it was never solved. And because it was never solved, it belongs not to historians, but to storytellers, dreamers, poets, and all who stand in awe of the unknown. The keepers are gone, but the story is alive. And perhaps, in the end, that is more enduring than flesh. The final image. Picture it. The year is 1900. A storm claws at the Hebrides. Waves slam against black cliffs. The lighthouse looms above, its beam cutting through rain like a sword of fire. Inside, 3 men tend the flame. One adjusts the clockwork, another writes in the log, the third stares out the window at the dark, shifting sea. A sound echoes, a boom, a knock, a voice. The men pause. Something compels them outside. A storm lantern in hand, they step into the howling night. The wind swallows their words. The waves rise. The sea roars. And then silence. The lantern burns on the table. The beds remain unmade. The chairs wait, empty. The lighthouse beam sweeps on, indifferent, eternal. The call of the Isles. Even now, more than a century later, the Flannan Isles call to us. They are not inviting. They are not safe. They are not kind. But they are unforgettable. Every mystery lover, every sailor, every poet feels the pull. To stand on those cliffs, to face the same wind, to listen for footsteps that never return. Because the Flannan Isles are not simply a place. They are a question, and the question is eternal. Epilogue, the 3 shadows. In the folklore of the Hebrides, some say that on the anniversary of their disappearance, 3 shadows appear at the lighthouse door. They do not move. They do not speak. They simply stand, outlined against the storm, as though waiting to be let in. When the wind howls and the sea beats its fists against the rocks, the shadows vanish once more. But the legend promises they will return again and again until the world itself grows quiet. For the sea keeps its secrets, and the Flannan Isles keep theirs.